Weekends are supposed to be about rest, adventure, and escape, but for some, they became a nightmare they could never forget. Hidden cabins, lonely lakes, and roadside motels hold secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Tonight, you'll hear 3 chilling TRUE stories of weekend getaways gone horribly wrong, stories that prove sometimes the trip you've been waiting for could be the last one you ever take. A group of 4 close friends, Daniel, Sarah, Mark, and Emily, had been planning a weekend getaway for months. Life in the city had worn them down with its constant noise, stress, and suffocating routine. So when Daniel suggested a trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods, the others eagerly agreed. The idea of disconnecting from the world and surrounding themselves with nature seemed perfect. They packed their bags with hiking gear, food supplies, and a few bottles of wine, ready for a carefree weekend. The drive took nearly 5 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads that felt like they were leading into another world. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the trees. The cabin appeared just as it had in the rental listing, small but cozy, with weathered wooden walls and a porch that faced the dense woods. At first glance, it looked charming in its rustic way, but something about its isolation felt unsettling. There were no other houses in sight, no sound of traffic, not even a bird singing. The silence was almost too perfect, and Sarah commented on how strange it felt to be somewhere so far removed from everything. Daniel laughed it off, assuring everyone that this was exactly what they needed. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged timber and something faintly damp, like rain-soaked earth. Dust clung to the corners, and the furniture was old but sturdy. They settled in quickly, unpacking their things and preparing a simple dinner. The mood was light at first, filled with jokes and laughter, but every now and then one of them would glance toward the windows, noticing the way the dark forest pressed close against the glass. As night fell, the silence outside grew heavier. Mark suggested putting on some music to chase away the eerie atmosphere, but the radio picked up nothing but static, and there was no cell service at all. Later, as they sat around the table with their glasses of wine, Emily thought she heard a sound from outside, a faint crunch, as if someone had stepped on dry leaves. She froze, straining to listen, but when she asked if anyone else had heard it, the others shook their heads. Mark teased her about being paranoid, yet Sarah admitted she felt the same unease, like they weren't entirely alone. Daniel tried to reassure them, pointing out that animals often roamed the woods at night. Still, the thought lingered, unspoken but shared among them, that this wasn't just the presence of animals. When it was time for bed, each of them retreated to their rooms, though sleep didn't come easily. The walls seemed too thin. Every creak of the wood amplified in the silence. Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustling that seemed to move around the cabin. Emily kept her lamp on, whispering to herself that it was only her imagination. Mark, usually the skeptic of the group, found himself waking several times in the night, convinced he had heard the sound of breathing just outside his window. The next morning began with an uneasy quiet, as if the forest itself was watching them. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, casting sharp streaks of gold across the cabin walls, but it did little to ease the lingering tension from the night before. Emily was the first to step outside, cradling a cup of coffee as she walked onto the porch. Her breath caught when she noticed the dirt near the steps looked disturbed, the kind of uneven impressions that suggested someone, or something, had been pacing around the cabin. She didn't call out immediately, unsure if it was just her nerves amplifying what might have been nothing more than animal tracks. When Daniel joined her, she hesitated, then pointed it out. He crouched down, squinting at the marks, but dismissed them with a shrug, saying the forest was bound to have visitors of the four-legged kind. Even so, Emily couldn't shake the prickling feeling at the back of her neck as she returned inside. The group decided to go hiking, eager to distract themselves. They followed a trail that wound through towering trees, the air cool and earthy, the forest floor littered with pine needles and moss. For a while, the beauty of nature distracted them, and their laughter echoed among the trees. But Sarah noticed something odd as they walked. Every so often, she felt as though someone was trailing behind them, a presence that disappeared whenever she turned to look. Mark dismissed her unease again, though he too kept glancing over his shoulder more often than usual. By the time they returned to the cabin in the afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted back to unease, their earlier excitement replaced by a low hum of anxiety. Inside, they began to notice small details they hadn't paid attention to before. Scratches ran along the wooden doorframe, deep enough to suggest force, not wear. A strange smell lingered in the back of the cabin, metallic and sharp, though no one could find the source. Sarah swore she felt cold spots when walking from room to room, as though invisible drafts of icy air followed her. Mark, still determined to keep spirits high, suggested lighting a fire and preparing dinner. They tried to laugh off their concerns, but the unease continued to grow, weaving its way into every corner of the cabin. As dusk fell, they sat on the porch, watching the forest sink into darkness. That was when Emily noticed something strange. In the distance, among the dense trees, she thought she saw movement, an outline that lingered just long enough to register before slipping out of sight. Her voice trembled as she told the others, but when they looked, there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to deepen, the trees swaying in a way that looked almost deliberate. Daniel insisted it was probably a trick of the light, but his voice lacked conviction. The sense of being watched, so strong it felt suffocating, settled over them all, making every sound. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Echo louder in the still night that night, unease grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on the cabin. The friends had tried to distract themselves with music and conversation, but without cell service or a working radio, the silence seemed endless, only broken by the occasional crackle from the fire. Emily sat closest to the window, her gaze drifting outside again and again. She couldn't explain why, but she felt as if her eyes were being drawn there, as though something beyond the glass was waiting for her to notice. At first it was just shadows moving between the trees, but soon she froze, her breath caught in her throat. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure, tall and still, too far to see clearly yet close enough that she knew it wasn't a trick of her imagination. She whispered for the others to look, but when Mark and Daniel rushed over, the space between the trees was empty. They laughed nervously, telling her she was overtired, though the unease was now written on their faces too. Sarah, usually the calmest among them, admitted she'd felt someone watching them since the night before. She described how she had seen faint movement outside her bedroom window, as though a shadow lingered too close, but she'd convinced herself it was paranoia. Now, hearing Emily's claim, the fear grew more real. Daniel tried to reassure everyone that maybe hikers or locals sometimes wandered through the woods, but his voice was shaky, betraying his own doubts. The night stretched on, dragging with it a gnawing tension. Every creak of the cabin made them jump. At one point, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside, slow, deliberate crunches of someone moving across the dry ground. Mark quickly blew out the lantern, plunging them into darkness, and they all sat frozen, straining their ears. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, then a faint tapping sound against the side of the cabin, irregular but distinct like fingers drumming on the wood. Sarah clutched Emily's hand, whispering frantically that they needed to leave, but Daniel insisted it would be reckless to run into the woods at night with no clear path. Minutes stretched into hours. The tapping eventually ceased, replaced by an even more unsettling sound, breathing. It was faint at first, a low rasp, as if someone were just outside the wall. Emily covered her ears, her eyes wide with terror, while Mark grabbed the nearest object he could use as a weapon. They huddled together, each too afraid to move, barely daring to breathe themselves. Then came the sound of footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, it was enjoyed drawing out their fear. Occasionally, the crunch of leaves would stop near a window, and though none of them dared to look, they could feel eyes pressing against the glass. The hours passed with unbearable slowness, and the group sat in tense silence. Their fear rising with every sound outside, their nerves unraveling, each of them realizing that whatever was out there was not passing through but staying close, watching, waiting. When morning finally came, the group felt no relief. The sun poured through the trees and filled the cabin with light, but it did nothing to chase away the dread that had settled inside. None of them had slept, their faces were pale, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. Daniel tried to rally everyone, insisting that what they'd experienced was just their nerves getting the better of them, but even he didn't sound convinced. The memory of the footsteps, the tapping, and the strange breathing lingered, gnawing at their minds like a sickness that wouldn't go away. Sarah argued that they should pack their bags and leave immediately, but the problem was clear. They were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, and without cell service or a map they couldn't risk wandering aimlessly into the woods. Reluctantly, they agreed to wait until the following morning when they could leave together after sunrise. To occupy themselves, they decided to venture outside. Mark suggested checking the perimeter of the cabin to prove nothing had really happened, but what they found only deepened their fear. In the dirt surrounding the cabin were footprints, dozens of them, circling in uneven patterns. Some led directly to the windows, others to the porch steps, and still more disappeared into the woods. They were not animal tracks, they were unmistakably human. Each print was deep, as if the person had stood in one place for a long time, pressing down into the soil. Sarah crouched low to inspect them, her voice trembling as she pointed out that many of the prints seemed larger than any of theirs, wider and longer, belonging to someone bigger and heavier. Emily refused to step outside after that, retreating to the cabin and shutting herself in the corner of the living room. She felt watched even in daylight, the forest looming like a wall of eyes. The others tried to comfort her, but fear was spreading through all of them. The smallest sounds made them flinch, the groan of wood in the walls, the rustle of branches outside, the occasional echo of what might have been distant laughter carried on the wind. Mark tried to keep busy by chopping firewood near the cabin, yet even as he swung the axe, his eyes darted constantly to the tree line. He swore he saw flashes of movement, someone slipping between the trunks, never stepping into the open. By midday, the air inside the cabin felt heavy and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Daniel sat at the table with a map he had packed, trying to chart a possible way back to the main road. His hands shook as he traced the lines, realizing just how far they were from civilization. Sarah paced the room, whispering that they should never have come, that something was terribly wrong with this place. Emily kept rocking back and forth, refusing to look toward the windows, while Mark returned from outside with a grim expression, saying he had heard someone whistling in the woods, though he hadn't seen anyone at all. The sun dipped lower that evening, and the cabin seemed to sink into the forest, rather than stand apart from it. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, long and sharp, and the air grew colder far too quickly for the time of day. The four of them gathered inside with every lamp and candle they could find, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. Emily barely spoke, her eyes darting toward the windows every few minutes, as if she expected something to appear there. Sarah tried to steady her breathing, clutching a blanket tightly, while Mark paced back and forth, his frustration and fear battling for control. Daniel attempted to take charge, telling them they just needed to get through one more night, but his words rang hollow, as though he were trying more to convince himself than the others. The silence outside was absolute, almost suffocating, until it was broken by a sudden sound. Laughter, faint but clear, drifting from the woods. It was not the laughter of children playing or of friends sharing a joke. It was low, distorted and wrong, as though carried through something hollow. The group froze, their bodies stiff with terror, listening as the sound echoed and then abruptly stopped. A few minutes later, there came the crunch of footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin just as they had heard the night before. Sarah whispered that they should hide, but Daniel shook his head, insisting they needed to stay together in the open. Mark grabbed the axe he had used earlier, his knuckles white as he clutched the handle. The footsteps drew closer, pausing now and then as if whoever was outside was listening to them. Emily covered her mouth to stop from crying out, tears streaking down her face as she shook her head violently. Then came a knock, 3 sharp raps against the wooden wall near the front door. The sound was so precise, so deliberate, that there was no way it could have been random. Sarah gasped, clinging to Daniel, who stood rooted to the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief. The knock was followed by silence so heavy that even the crackle of the fire seemed to fade. Suddenly, another knock came, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. Then another at the back wall, louder and quicker, as though more than one person was outside. Mark shouted into the dark, demanding to know who was there, his voice breaking as he tried to sound brave. The only reply was a low dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. The sound moved along the side of the cabin, slow and menacing, until it stopped beneath one of the windows. Emily couldn't help herself. She turned her head, and though the others begged her not to, she let out a choked sob. She had seen something staring in, a pale face pressed against the glass for only a second, before disappearing into the night. The hours that followed dragged on like a waking nightmare. None of them dared to move from the living room, as though the thin walls of the cabin offered any real protection. The air was thick with smoke from the fire, the shadows trembling across the walls each time the flames cracked. No one spoke above a whisper, and even that felt dangerous, as if their voices might draw more attention from whatever lingered outside. Sarah sat closest to the door, her body tense, clutching the fireplace poker, so tightly her knuckles were drained of color. Mark stayed near the window with the axe in hand, his eyes locked on the glass as though bracing himself for another face to appear. Emily sat on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, trembling violently, while Daniel hovered over her, trying to whisper reassurances he barely believed himself. Then came the sound that broke what little calm they had managed to hold on to. A series of sharp, dragging scratches tore across the wooden boards of the cabin's exterior. The noise was deliberate, methodical, as if nails, or claws, were being raked down the side of the building. It started at one corner and slowly traveled along the walls, circling them, moving closer with every pass. Each scrape reverberated through the air, making Emily sob openly while Sarah bit her lip until it bled. Daniel tried to steady them, saying maybe it was just branches scraping in the wind, but there was no wind, and the sound was too exact, too controlled. The scratching stopped suddenly, plunging the cabin into silence so deep they could hear each other's breathing. Just when they thought it might be over, a violent pounding shook the front door. 3 heavy bangs rattled the frame, so forceful that dust shook from the ceiling beams. Mark gripped the axe tighter, shouting that whoever was out there needed to leave, but his voice cracked, betraying the terror he was trying to mask. The banging stopped, and for a long, agonizing stretch, nothing followed. Then, from the back wall came a low thud, as though something massive had slammed against the wood. Sarah screamed when she noticed the doorknob moving, turning slightly before stopping as if someone had tested it. She jumped back, pulling Daniel with her, and they all stared at the door as though it might burst open at any second. Mark positioned himself between it and the others, his body shaking but determined to fight if it came to that. The knob stilled again, leaving them in a silence so suffocating that every creak of the wood sounded like an approaching step. Emily buried her face in her hands, whispering over and over that they should have left, that they were being hunted. The fire began to die, and the cabin dimmed into flickering shadows. Just as Daniel was about to add more logs, the sound of whistling floated in through the cracks of the walls, slow and tuneless, circling the cabin with a patience that was far more terrifying than rage. The night dragged into the early hours of the morning, but no one dared to sleep. Their nerves were frayed, their bodies exhausted, yet fear kept them sharp, tethered to every sound that crept through the trees. The whistling had stopped sometime before dawn, but its absence only made the silence worse. They huddled close to the dying fire, the room dim and suffocating, as though the cabin itself had grown smaller during the night. Mark sat against the wall, the axe resting in his lap, his eyes bloodshot from hours of staring at the door. Daniel tried to appear strong, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him, and Sarah whispered prayers under her breath, rocking slightly as if to calm herself. Emily hadn't spoken since the night before, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears, and she refused to look at the windows at all. When the sun finally began to rise, its light should have brought relief, but instead it revealed something more chilling. On the glass of the front window were streaks of smeared handprints, long and greasy, as though someone had pressed their face and palms hard against it before sliding them down. Sarah was the first to see it and screamed, startling the others awake. The prints were too large, too distorted to belong to any of them. The sight was enough to break whatever fragile hope had been left. Emily begged them to leave right away, her voice hoarse but urgent, and for the first time no one argued. They agreed it was no longer safe to stay even another hour. Gathering what little they could, they shoved clothes and food into their bags, their movements frantic and clumsy. Daniel studied the map again, trying to recall the path that led back toward the main road, but his eyes flickered constantly to the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any second. Mark went outside first, clutching the axe tightly, scanning the woods for movement. At first, everything was still. The forest was drenched in pale morning light, mist coiling low between the trees. But then he noticed something that made his stomach drop. In the dirt, fresh footprints circled the cabin, overlapping the old ones from the night before. The sheer number of them was staggering, dozens, maybe more, pressed deep into the earth, evidence that several figures had been there while they huddled inside. He called for the others, his voice breaking, and they stepped out onto the porch, staring at the marks with wide eyes. Sarah covered her mouth to stifle a scream, while Emily clutched her bag to her chest as though it would shield her. Daniel muttered that they had to move now, no matter what. Without another word, they descended the steps and entered the woods, their hearts pounding as every tree seemed to hold a shadow, every sound a threat. The cabin loomed behind them, but even as they left it, none of them felt any safer, because the deeper they walked, the more it felt like they were stepping into something's territory rather than escaping from it. The forest was unnervingly quiet as they pushed deeper into it, the mist curling between the trees and clinging to their clothes like damp fingers. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, the crunch of leaves and snapping twigs echoing unnaturally in the still air. Daniel led the way with the map in his trembling hands, trying to stay composed, though the lines blurred each time his vision shook from lack of sleep. Sarah stayed close behind him, whispering for him to hurry, while Emily and Mark followed at the rear, constantly looking over their shoulders, as if something might lunge from the shadows at any moment. The woods felt endless, the trees all blending together, and it was impossible to tell if they were making progress or only circling back toward the cabin. Emily was the first to hear it, a faint rhythm hidden beneath the sound of their footsteps, branches snapping behind them, keeping pace no matter how fast or slow they walked. She grabbed Mark's sleeve, her face drained of color, and when he stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. He tried to dismiss it, but when they continued on, the noise returned, closer this time, as though whoever was following them no longer cared to hide. Sarah's breaths grew shallow as she glanced behind her, catching what she thought was a figure slipping between the trees, tall and hunched, gone in an instant, but real enough to make her stumble forward in panic. Daniel urged everyone to keep moving, his voice shaky but determined, insisting the road couldn't be far. Yet the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, mocking them with its sameness. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way, until the light began to fade again. They hadn't eaten, hadn't rested, and exhaustion was pulling them apart. Emily broke down in tears, insisting she couldn't go on, and Sarah crouched beside her, whispering comfort through her own fear. Mark grew restless, snapping that they had to keep moving before nightfall trapped them again. But even as he spoke, a new sound rippled through the trees. It was the same low whistling from the night before, carried on the breeze, but this time there were more voices, layered and discordant, surrounding them from every direction. Panic erupted among the group. Daniel tried to lead them faster, his eyes darting from tree to tree, but the woods seemed alive with movement now. Dark shapes flitted between the trunks, too quick to be clearly seen but unmistakably human in size. Emily clung to Sarah, crying out that they were being herded, and Daniel realized with a sick twist in his gut that she was right. Their path was no longer their own. Every time they tried to veer in a new direction, the shapes shifted, cutting them off, guiding them deeper into the forest instead of toward safety. The whistling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to vibrate inside their heads, and the trees themselves felt like a cage tightening around them. As the sun bled away and night swallowed the woods, once more the forest had become a labyrinth of shadows as night fell, each tree stretching upward like a dark sentinel that blocked out the moonlight. The four of them moved together in a tight cluster, no longer bothering to follow the map, driven only by the desperate need to find any kind of shelter. Their breaths came out in ragged bursts, each one visible in the cold air, and the silence between the bursts of distant whistling was somehow worse than the sound itself. Daniel tried to keep them calm, his voice low and firm, but the words carried no conviction, and his eyes betrayed how lost he truly was. Sarah clung to his arm, whispering over and over that they weren't going to make it out, while Emily lagged slightly behind, her legs trembling with every step, and Mark hovered protectively near her, his grip tight on the axe though his own courage was rapidly crumbling. It wasn't long before the forest began to change. The mist grew thicker, rolling low to the ground like smoke, and the air turned damp and heavy, carrying with it the faint stench of rot. The trees became denser, the spaces between them narrowing, until it felt as though the woods themselves were trying to trap them. Branches snagged at their clothes, scratched at their arms and faces, forcing them to move slower, more vulnerable with every step. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped loudly, deliberate and echoing, and all of them froze in place, staring into the darkness. Mark raised the axe, his hands shaking, while Emily whimpered quietly into her sleeve. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Sarah saw it again, the same pale face she had glimpsed at the cabin window, now peering at them from behind a tree. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared with eyes that seemed too wide, too hollow. She screamed, and when the others turned, it was gone. They broke into a run, stumbling through the underbrush, their footsteps crashing through the silence as though inviting pursuit. Behind them, laughter erupted, low, distorted, and multiplied as if dozens of voices were mocking them in unison. It followed them through the trees, growing louder with every frantic step they took. Exhaustion finally caught up to Emily, and she collapsed to her knees, unable to go any further. Daniel and Sarah tried to lift her, but she shook violently, insisting through her sobs that they were surrounded, that running was pointless. Mark tried to argue, pulling her arm to force her back up, but the truth was clear when they all looked around. Shadows shifted in every direction, darting between the trees, some tall and broad, others hunched and unnatural. The forest was alive with movement, and no path seemed safe. Daniel's heart pounded as he realized they had been driven into this exact spot, funneled like prey into a trap. The whistling began again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps drawing in from all sides, sealing off any chance of escape. The circle of shadows around them closed tighter with every passing second. The forest alive with the sound of feet crunching leaves and branches, though no single figure ever stepped fully into view. Emily clung to Sarah, trembling uncontrollably, while Mark stood in front of them, the axe raised, though his arms quivered from exhaustion. Daniel's mind raced for options, but none made sense. They were deep in the woods with no clear path, and surrounded by something that had hunted them all night. The whistling grew clearer, low and deliberate, weaving through the air like a cruel lullaby, and then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise, pressing down on them until they could barely breathe. From the trees, shapes began to emerge at last. Figures stepped into the dim light of the moon, their outlines long and twisted. Faces shrouded in shadow except for the pale gleam of hollow eyes reflecting the firelight that had faded from their abandoned cabin. There were more of them than the group could count, standing unnaturally still, watching. None of them spoke, none of them moved closer, and that absence of action was worse than violence. It was patience, the kind a predator shows when it knows escape is impossible. Daniel tried to shout at them, demanding to know what they wanted, his voice cracking in the night, but there was no answer, only silence. Mark gritted his teeth and raised the axe higher, ready to charge if he had to, but Sarah begged him not to. The moment stretched unbearably, until finally one of the figures lifted its hand and pointed deeper into the forest. Without words, without movement, the message was clear. They wanted the group to go further, into the unknown, deeper into whatever lay hidden in the dark. Daniel shook his head, realizing that everything since the cabin, the whistling, the knocks, the footprints, had been leading them to this moment, steering them toward something far worse than being left alone in the woods. Still they moved. Fear forced their legs to carry them forward, deeper into the thickening mist as the figures melted back into the trees, following silently, guiding them. Hours seemed to blur as they stumbled blindly until they reached a clearing lit faintly by moonlight. In its center stood a structure that didn't belong, an ancient, crumbling stone foundation, half swallowed by the forest, covered in moss and roots. The figures stopped at the edge of the clearing, surrounding it like sentinels. Daniel realized too late what they had been driven toward. As the group stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath them shuddered with a hollow echo, and the figures closed in around the perimeter, sealing them inside. The last thing Sarah saw before darkness consumed them was a tall figure stepping into the moonlight, its face stretched into an unnatural grin, eyes empty but burning with hunger. Their screams carried into the trees, but the forest swallowed them quickly, leaving the clearing silent once more. By morning, there was no sign of the group, only scattered belongings lying in the dirt, as though they had never existed at all. Thank you so much for joining me for this chilling journey into 3 scary TRU weekend getaway horror stories. Your support means the world, and I hope these tales kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying true horror experiences every week. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the scariest places are the ones that seem the most peaceful. Until next time, good night.